The following program is a special presentation of Homeland Security Television.
Hello and welcome to Homeland Security Television's Terrorism Awareness and Prevention course. For the next 30 minutes, we will explore the evolving threat of terrorism here in the United States. More specifically, we're going to look at the steps a terrorist or terrorist cell usually goes through to carry out an attack and hopefully give you the ability to observe and identify terrorist activity before an attack occurs. But before we get started, a note about what this course is and isn't designed to do. First, our goal is not to provide an exhaustive history of terrorist tactics or to overwhelm you with the technical details of weapons, explosives, or targets. This short introduction to identifying and preventing terrorism is also not a license for anybody to go out and interfere in law enforcement investigations or meant to create a culture of fear in our communities. We urge you to leave the heavy lifting to the professionals in law enforcement and Homeland Security. If you're already a law enforcement or Homeland Security professional, then this course will be a good introduction or refresher. So then, what are we trying to achieve? Well, at Homeland Security Television, we believe that if average Americans are armed with a little knowledge about the indicators of possible terrorist activity, we can defeat terrorism and save countless innocent lives. We all have a role to play in Homeland Security. And because our law enforcement and Homeland Security professionals can't be everywhere at all times, it is up to each of us, when necessary, to be able to identify and report suspicious activity that could be part of a terrorist plot to harm us, our friends, and families. And that's what we hope you will be able to do after watching this short program. Terrorists come in many varieties. There are eco-terrorists, narco-terrorists, racial supremacists, a variety of anti-government and anarchist groups, and of course, the threat we are all familiar with, radical Islamic terrorism, which in addition to being responsible for the worst terrorist attack in history, continues to pose the single biggest threat to the security of Americans at home and abroad. Terrorists also come from a variety of nationalities, as well as ethnic, religious, and racial backgrounds. Therefore, attempts to profile terrorists are usually ineffective. It is much more effective, and the goal of this program, to focus on the known behaviors and activities of terrorists. Al-Qaeda and other well-organized, well-funded, and well-trained terrorist groups spend months and years planning their operations. And while well-planned attacks can be difficult to stop, almost all such terrorist plots involve a variety of activities that are detectable if you know what to look for. And Americans have a distinct advantage in this regard. First, we vastly outnumber the terrorists who are trying to do us harm. Therefore, the more Americans who take this type of training and keep a watchful eye out for suspicious behavior, the better our chances are of disrupting a terrorist attack before it is too late. More importantly, nobody knows our neighbors, streets, and places of work better than we do. Each of us is armed with a wealth of knowledge when it comes to knowing what is normal activity for a given location where we live, work, and play. What is necessary is the ability to notice unusual activity or behavior. Identify that activity or behavior as being potentially terrorist-related, and knowing what to do with this information once you've determined it to be suspicious. Put another way, we all know what the baseline of normal activity is for the places where we live and work. We can leverage this knowledge by remaining vigilant for subtle and sometimes glaring departures from this baseline. Only then can we analyze a suspicious person's behavior for possible terrorist activity. So now, let's take a detailed look at the terrorist attack cycle. It is by understanding the different phases a terrorist goes through to plan and conduct an attack that we can better understand the warning signs we should be looking for.
One of the things I believe that we have always been concerned about is the kind of terrorist that we're looking for. Everybody seems to ask, what is a terrorist? A terrorist could be sadly, could be your next door neighbor that you have not known his background, or he could be from somewhere, not necessarily just from the Middle East, it could be anywhere from the region of an Islamic country or non-Islamic country. However, they don't come in garbs. They don't come in with headpieces. They don't come in walking around with their Qur'ans. You know, of course, perception, and we see somebody walking in with either a kafiyeh, or he's wearing his garbs, or he's wearing a cap. Right away we're looking at that person, could be a concern, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for that key individual who could be totally undetected to the eye. That could be a person that we can have to really look at, and as CBP officers and as individuals you're our first point of protection.
And the bottom line is the intelligence that I see and have had the opportunity to see, whether it was with the Sheriff's Office or the Domestic Security Task Force, they're alive and well and operating in this country. Not only sleeper cells, we've got training areas in this country. And people need to focus on that, and law enforcement needs to make sure that they've got the proper resources that can deal with collecting that intelligence and working with the federal authorities so that you can prevent something from happening. One thing I learned is they can be in the very remote areas of Afghanistan. They can attack a rather simplistic hotel. They could be at the roundabout in your community. They could be at your financial institution. And they are always looking for those weaker, milder targets these days. And it's something that we need to take very seriously.
All terrorist attacks generally follow a 5-stage process, during which all of the pieces of the puzzle are put together to better the chances of the attack being successful. The good news is that almost all of the activities associated with each phase of this process can be detected, and an attack can be stopped at any stage, even right up to the last minute. The stages of a terrorist attack are as follows: planning, acquisition, surveillance, rehearsal, and attack. Let's take a look at each stage in detail to give you a better sense of what to look for. Planning. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda conduct detailed planning in support of their attacks, which may partly explain why many of their larger, more devastating attacks often take place months, if not years, apart. That said, the planning stage is where a target is selected, potential terrorist actors are identified, and appropriate tactics and weapons are selected. But it is the target selection that has the most relevance for our purposes. Fortunately, or unfortunately, we have a long history of terrorist attacks to study, and from that history, we can predict the types of targets terrorists are most likely to go after in the future. For example, mass transportation continues to be a high priority target for groups like Al-Qaeda for a number of reasons. First, planes and trains make good television images when attacked and carry hundreds of potential victims. The same can be said of buses that travel through crowded city streets. We also know that iconic structures, such as the various monuments or government buildings in our nation's capital, or large multinational corporations and banking institutions in large cities, are often considered high-probability targets for terrorists. But terrorists can also be practical when they have to be. Therefore, when similar targets present themselves, terrorists will almost always gravitate toward the structure with fewer security protections, the so-called soft target. So understanding the targeting mindset of terrorists is critical to understanding the level of threat facing a particular locale. The acquisition phase. The acquisition phase of a terrorist operation is when all of the different elements required to carry out an attack are acquired by the terrorist leader or cell. Everything from money to fund the operation, to recruiting other terrorists, obtaining weapons, arranging for travel, false identities, and establishing a communications plan are undertaken during the acquisition phase. Sometimes, during this phase, smaller crimes are committed in support of the larger conspiracy. Take, for example, the case of Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, killing 191 and wounding hundreds more. Months before the bombing, McVeigh purchased hundreds of pounds of ammonium nitrate, a substance used in fertilizers for large-scale farming operations. And while this act in itself was suspicious, they also broke into a nearby quarrying operation and stole explosive components that were used to blast granite in the quarry. It was these explosive components that would be used to detonate the drums of ammonium nitrate at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Even some of the 9/11 hijackers were guilty of petty crimes, such as obtaining illegal driver's licenses and overstaying their visas. So the important point here is that even small, relatively insignificant incidents, when studied within a larger context, can point to larger terrorist plots. In today's environment, it is not necessary for a terrorist to smuggle weapons and explosives into the United States to carry out an attack. Not only are weapons easily obtained, but all of the components necessary to build powerful improvised explosive devices are readily accessible at most local hardware and grocery stores. Terrorists understand this and will most likely attempt to acquire these materials and weapons here in the U.S.
We look at some of the explosives that the Al-Qaeda had been using in their early suicide bombs. These were triacetone triperoxide was one of them, TATP, a very sensitive, very energetic material. Basically a half coffee cup of this dried white powder on the desk behind me would most likely kill me and damage pretty much everything in the room. And it's made using beautician's grade hydrogen peroxide and acetone, fingernail polish remover. Not very difficult to make. Query your internet server and you're able to find a recipe. Anyone could manufacture TNT. Again, if you could follow a baking recipe, you could make trinitrotoluene, TNT, at home.
This is a mock-up of the bomb that was used at Centennial Park, the Olympics in Atlanta, 1996. Eric Rudolph made a bomb very much like this, involving 3 large metal pipes that were filled with gunpowder and then electrically fused to a lantern battery with a time delay to initiate the device. This is a typical electric fusing system, as we would call it. Basically, it creates a time delay that enables the bomb maker to place the device and then safely get away or remove himself from the area. Here you can see we've got a mechanical alarm clock that is set up to allow for a certain amount of elapsed time, and at the end of that time the device would close the circuit, so to speak, and allow electricity to flow from the lantern battery through the wiring into a fusing mechanism within the pipes. And again, as I mentioned, the 3 pipes were filled with gunpowder, and you can see a large quantity of nails, what we call cut nails, that are used in flooring and other types of woodworking. And it was one of these nails, as a matter of fact, that killed the lone person who died in that Centennial Park bombing. But that is a typical configuration. It was quite heavy. He carried it in a knapsack and then set the knapsack down in the park there at Centennial Park. And again, it's a good example of an electrical fusing system with a time delay type of initiation.
It is our responsibility to keep watch for purchases of large quantities of materials that just don't make sense. In addition, if you work for an employer that requires a uniform, and by virtue of having that uniform, you are granted access to areas of buildings that are typically off limits to the general public, you should report any incidents involving uniform thefts or missing uniform items. Surveillance. Surveillance is undoubtedly one of the most critical steps in the process of conducting a terrorist attack. Terrorists often conduct detailed and comprehensive surveillance of targets or potential targets over long periods of time. For example, the Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorist group sent an operative to Mumbai, India, a year before their planned attack in November 2008. For many months, the operative visited the planned target areas and developed detailed maps and floor plans that were subsequently delivered to the terrorists' commanders in Pakistan. So what are terrorists interested in surveying, and how might they do it? For starters, they want to gain an understanding of how easy or difficult it might be for them to succeed in attacking the intended target. Although a lot depends on the type of attack they are planning, they will study things like: are there guards present? If so, are they armed? How many? Locations. Is there a security screening process to get into or near the facility or structure? What are the approaches to the target? Are there bollards or obstacles preventing a vehicle from getting close enough to do damage? What times of day is the target area most crowded with people? When are the guards undergoing shift changes? And any other vulnerabilities or potential secondary effects that might be possible by targeting this location. So how, specifically, might terrorists go about collecting this type of information? The answer to that question is pretty much the same way any intelligence professional might. They might take photographs, draw sketches or diagrams, walk around the area repeatedly without any discernible aim or objective, ask strange or unusual questions about the facility and its surroundings. All of this information is usually then placed in a comprehensive targeting package. And in the case of the more sophisticated Al-Qaeda plots, the information is often collected in digital form and placed on computers. Our military and intelligence professionals have discovered countless laptop computers in the most desolate of locations around the world, containing detailed planning information on potential targets in the U.S. and Europe. So we must realize that the terrorist enemy is in a constant state of motion during the entire attack cycle, providing ample opportunity for us to pick up the signs of unusual activity. Rehearsal. Like any coordinated military operation, terrorist cells often rehearse their attacks prior to actually conducting them. It is important to note, however, that this is not a required phase in the terrorist attack cycle of activity, but it is often looked upon as an important step that could uncover problems in the terrorist plan. In short, the rehearsal phase is designed to both test the terrorist attack plan and the likely response of local security agencies. So here are some indicators of a possible terrorist rehearsal of an attack. Are there multiple individuals acting suspiciously in the same vicinity? Are there vehicles present in areas where vehicles are either prohibited or not usually present? Have you noticed a person or people dressed or acting in a way that does not fit the norm for your location? For example, are they dressed sloppily or casually at your place of business? Or are they wearing a large coat or jacket in warm weather? Have any of these individuals attempted on one or more occasions to pass through security carrying suspicious items for that setting? In perhaps the most well-known and highly publicized examples of a full-blown terrorist rehearsal that was observed, identified, and reported was the case of actor James Woods. A few weeks prior to the attacks of September 11, 2001, Mr. Woods observed several men of Middle Eastern origin acting suspiciously on a flight from Boston to Los Angeles. They seemed to be watching the activity near the cockpit with keen interest, and even attempted to count the passengers aboard the aircraft. Woods actually reported what he had observed, but obviously his suspicions were not investigated. Following the terrible attacks on 9/11, the FBI presented Woods with photographs of the hijackers and, to their surprise, Woods positively identified several of them as having been the individuals who were acting suspiciously aboard his flight. The attack phase. The attack phase is obviously the last and final step in the terrorist attack cycle, but it is by no means a foregone conclusion that the attack will succeed or even be carried out. The reality is that even as terrorists are moving toward their target, citizens can observe suspicious behaviors, alert authorities, and either disrupt or prevent an attack. This could be as simple and obvious as observing someone who leaves behind a bag or package in a public place, or an individual who is dressed inappropriately for the weather and is acting nervously or sweating profusely. In the 2008 attacks in Mumbai, India, for example, an alert citizen noticed the 10 terrorists arrive from the sea on a motorized rubber boat, each carrying a backpack. The citizen questioned the young men. Their response was that they were simply students. Unfortunately, that alert citizen did not follow up on what turned out to be an accurate hunch that something was not right with what he was observing. Those 10 young men went on to carry out a 3-day siege of Mumbai, costing the lives of 173 people. You may also notice more than one suspicious person acting together. For example, you may notice several vehicles arrive at a location where vehicles are prohibited. Or you may notice 2 individuals arrive at a location with one individual seeming to direct the actions of the other. Of course, all of these observations must be put into the appropriate context before a determination can be made that the people and activity observed represent a departure from the baseline of normal activity for that location. Reporting. So now that you've observed something suspicious, what should you do? Reporting suspicious behavior should be done in a timely manner, with as much detail as you can remember. However, even if a new incident reminds you of something you observed weeks or months earlier, you should report that as well. However, there are some basic guidelines you should follow when reporting incidents to law enforcement. You should provide the following information: your name, position, and/or company you work for, your current location and a callback number, the suspicious behavior observed, an exact description of the suspect or suspects and their location. And you should stay on the line until the 911 operator tells you to hang up or provides you with specific instructions. If the activity you observe does not appear to be time sensitive, the Department of Homeland Security urges you to report tips to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You can do so online at www.tips.fbi.gov. What we've tried to do during this program is provide a general overview of how terrorists pick their targets, plan and carry out their attacks, and the indicators and warning signs they give off during each phase of the operation. Again, it is important that private citizens never attempt to stop or question potential terrorist suspects. Alert your local law enforcement agency or security department to the activity you observed and let the professionals handle it. Terrorists do not wear uniforms and will make every attempt to fit into their surroundings and not raise suspicions. But as we have seen, there is ample opportunity throughout the terrorist attack cycle for all of us to recognize the indicators and warning signs that are almost always observable. For the Homeland Security Television channel, thank you for watching.